morning, good evening, and good afternoon. I hope you guys been having a wonderful day. I know I have. First, I want to apologize for the lateness of this episode. My computer was getting some repairs, and it took a lot longer to get back than I was usually expecting and was told. But here I am. I got my computer back and everything is running smoothly. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into today's episode. So, in today's episode, we will be talking about video game crossovers. Now, for this subject, I will not be counting a game having skins as a crossover. So, that's basically eliminating all of Call of Duty and some of Fortnite. Now, for the crossovers I'll be talking about, these crossovers would have to affect the main story in some way, have the actual character in as themselves with their own story within the game that may be separate from the main story, or can be a temporary crossover that affects the game. So crossovers has been a thing in nerd media for years, especially with the long-lived question of who would win if they fought against each other. Now, we see a lot of crossovers in the form of comics, and that's where a lot of them happen. It's just easier to do that stuff, especially with different studios having the rights to certain characters, whether it be their TV rights or movie rights. We sometimes get crossovers in films and other media, but in video games, before, it was a very rare occurrence with crossovers happening in only certain games. Nowadays, kids are basically spoiled with games like Fortnite, Warzone, PUBG, and other types of live service games having crossovers with different franchises every other season or every season. And it either affects the main storyline or it's a temporary thing that affects the map that they're in. Like I said, in the past, we would rarely get crossovers between characters. And for the most part, it would just be a character that would be an unlockable thing. Like in a fighting game, you have to do a certain amount of stuff to unlock a character. But there were few exceptions to this rule. In 1988, video game history would be made as the first video game crossover would happen, and the company to make this happen would be Konami, who was responsible for many popular franchises in the world of video games. This game would be called, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Konami YY World. This game was released only in Japan, which probably makes sense on why I've never heard of it, or probably any other person has heard of it, and would basically have you play as either Konami Man or Konami Lady. And they would have you go into different game worlds to save their respective characters from their worlds. This game basically played like a Castlevania game, and ironically did have Simon Belmont III from the Castlevania series. They also had Griamon from the Gamber Guiamon series. I don't know what that is. Gizi Fuma from the Famicom series. Mikey Walsh from the Goonies. Yes, the Goonies. Apparently Konami had the rights to the video game, so they added him in here for some godforsaken reason. Moy Alexandria from the Greatest series, and King Kong. So we got 2 Americans in this Japanese-only game, and many other characters as well. This would be very successful as these characters got to meet each other and play an integral part of the story in a way that they would have never met before. I mean, I really don't see any of these characters meeting and playing with each other. I mean, heck, King Kong is probably the biggest person out of all these characters, so I really don't see him hanging out with a lot of these guys, especially Mikey from the Goonies. That's an interesting 180. But many other companies would hop onto this idea and start combining their IPs with other well-known IPs or other IPs that would not be well-known, but since the company owns their IP, it would basically be a way for them to garner interest in these characters. So it was a smart business move. Most of the crossovers in the late 1980s and 90s would consist of fighting games, as this would be the easiest to have a crossover and mostly create a story. The most famous crossover games to happen during this era would be the Marvel vs. Capcom series. This crossover series cemented the idea of crossovers in video games. This series, ironically, did not start with Marvel vs. Capcom 1, but with X-Men vs. Street Fighter. The game was released in 1996 and had about 17 characters in it. There wasn't really a set story for the game, and it was basically there as a tag team beat 'em up, but it didn't stop anyone from playing the game, and it was widely praised. Marvel, seeing the success of this, greenlighted its sequel, which was Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. This had about 17 characters, with 2 of them being X-Men, who were Cyclops and Wolverine. There was a basic story in the game where the boss was Cyber Akuma, who you had to stop, but for the most part, what anyone wanted to do was basically see who was the best in the game, waste their quarters in the arcade, and have some fun. This game had very interesting Marvel characters, like Samo Gorath and Blackheart. I honestly don't know who Gorath was. I know who Blackheart was, but when I was reading this, I was like, who? And when I looked, I was like, interesting. It honestly surprised me that Capcom would pick such an obscure character, especially since there were other well-known characters out there. The massive success of this game and the praise from the arcades everywhere told Marvel it was time to take off the kitty gloves and gave us the 3rd entry of this series, which would be Marvel vs. Capcom 1 Clash of Heroes, which featured 15 characters, 7 from Marvel, 8 from Capcom, which wasn't just limited to Street Fighter characters anymore. One thing that was interesting was instead of having Iron Man in the game, they had War Machine, which when I first thought about it didn't make any sense, but the more I cemented into this, it actually did begin to make sense because War Machine looks like a mech from different anime and manga, especially since he has guns. I mean, sure, Iron Man has his repulsors and so did War Machine, but you gotta remember, War Machine has missile launchers, guns, machine guns, mini guns. So he basically looks like a Japanese mech, which makes it understandable on why they would pick him over a regular Iron Man. So go Rhodey. Anyway, this game was even more of a massive success and even had toy sales going through the roof. This game outsold Street Fighter 3, which was Capcom's most successful game at the time. This led to the most famous entry in the Marvel vs. Capcom series, which was Marvel vs. Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes. This game, of course, was a phenomenal game with great fighting mechanics, movesets, which set the characters apart and allowed for different players to play around with different fighting styles. And it had over 50 characters, which is a lot more than what we get in fighting games today. And it had the biggest roster to date. 50 characters with their own movesets, with their own story, with their own mechanics. Think about that. If a fighting game came out today and it had 50 characters that weren't DLC, it would blow everybody's minds. Nowadays, everyone has to wait with a certain roster. Maybe they'll have a roster of 10, 15, and the rest would be DLC. Heck, I don't even think we even get a roster of 15 anymore. But anyway, it was unheard of to have 50 characters in a game that were playable. So this was huge. And while the ending would basically be the same no matter who you picked, it was still cool to have all these characters cross over with each other to fight each other. One of my favorite characters playing in this game was definitely Venom. I loved having Venom, Hulk, and Spider-Man. Heck, I even liked having Ryu in the game. It was pretty cool. And the art, the 2D animation art was just beautiful. I still remember going to an arcade and seeing this game there, which surprised me because I didn't think anyone had this game anymore, especially in arcade form. I think I wasted about $10 on this game, brought back so many memories, and I had so much fun playing it. Besides Marvel vs. Capcom 2, there would be 2 other entries in the series, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which would have a bigger plot storyline, but they weren't as well received as 2, especially Infinite. They had such a terrible roster. I mean, they didn't even have X-Men characters, which just bummed us out because it was just an Avengers vs. Capcom game, not even like a whole Marvel vs. Capcom game. But besides Marvel vs. Capcom, Capcom would have their own franchises crossover with others. Street Fighter, which was one of Capcom's, and probably is still one of Capcom's biggest franchises, actually did a crossover with Tekken, which of course had Tekken characters. But the difference in this crossover was that the Tekken characters played like Street Fighter characters, which was okay, but understandable since Tekken fighting games are more grounded. They don't have the fast movement speeds as Street Fighter games games. And not to mention, Tekken fighters don't have a lot of ranged attacks. You have to get up close and personal, or you have to be somewhat a little far from your character to actually do some damage depending on who you're playing. But this didn't stop the devs from having a little bit of fun. And like I said, it was an okay game. It could have been a lot better, but it is what it is. But this wouldn't be the last time Street Fighter would interfere with the Tekken world, because the devs thought, you know what? We love the character Akuma. What if he was part of the Tekken universe and was a main character in the storyline of Tekken 7? So you know what happened? Akuma appeared as a special guest character and was a part of the main story. This crossover would just baffle me, because there's no reason for Akuma to be a part of the Tekken universe. It would have been cool for him to basically be a crossover character, because I mean, they had Negan as a crossover character, but he was just in the arcade. Akuma was a part of the main storyline where Hakashi basically hired him to hunt down his son and his wife. Like, seriously? Where did that come from? And you know what was the craziest part of this crossover? So as stated before, Tekken fighting games are a lot more grounded and not as fast. Apparently nobody told the devs this when making Akuma into the game, because he basically played like he was in Street Fighter. While he didn't have as much reach, once he got in there, you were screwed. He had, of course, his ranged attacks. He had his fast twirling attacks. I don't remember the name, so don't kill me over that. But still, he had his Hadouken, he had his other attacks, which made him an aggressive fighter. But again, there's not really a big counter. You had to make sure the guy who was playing Akuma didn't know what he was doing for you to actually be able to fight him. And even then, he would be a hard fighter to fight against, because his movesets, again, while a bit slower, were faster in combination, and he hit a lot harder. Sure, you could sidestep his Hadouken, but still, it was frustrating to play against. And story-wise, didn't make any sense. It really didn't. But anyway, that was the last time a Street Fighter player character would appear in the Tekken series, because one, he didn't have that much effect. He's not even in Tekken 8. So I guess we can ignore his part. Honestly, if he even took Akuma out, wouldn't really change anything in the main story. But again, it was just a weird decision from them, and I really would like to know the idea behind that. Now, Capcom wasn't the only player in town who thought during this time that a crossover would be successful. Nintendo put their hat in the ring and gave us another masterpiece, which would be Super Smash Bros. Now, this game was different from other games from the get-go, because while it was a fighting game, they didn't have any health bars and didn't have any complicated button combinations. If you played old school Street Fighter, heck, even if you play new school Street Fighter and Tekken, they have these weird button combinations which you have to get perfectly for them to be able to do their super moves, and sometimes it can be complicated, and if you do one misstep, that's it for the combination, it's dead. When it came to Nintendo, simplification was the key. Instead of having, of course, a health bar, they had a damage meter which could go up as high as 999, but made you easier to knock out as that number went higher. And everyone had the same control combinations for each of their characters' combos, which made it user-friendly, as again, some of the combinations in the fighting games were insane. And this would allow for limitations to be put on how many combos a character could have. Now, the first Super Smash Bros. Game had about 12 playable characters from various franchises that Nintendo owned and became super successful. This would spawn 3 other entries in the franchise, which would be super hits and have even more crossovers, who would be integral to the overall story. In the first game, the story was basically fighting your way to the end until the Master Hand would appear, which would be the final boss. The second game would basically be the same. It wasn't until the third game, which had its own storyline and was the first game to have third-party crossovers. They had characters like Sonic, Solid Snake, and many more. The latest entry in the Super Smash series would expand the characters to add even more third parties, so like Sora, Cloud, Joker from Persona, Bayonetta, and many, many more. And all these characters played a role in the story, and they were fun to play against too. I mean, I remember when I got my hands on frickin' Ryu. He was a fun character. He had a terrible recovery jump, but he was still fun to play as. Mortal Kombat also decided to throw its hat in the ring and gave us a very mediocre game, which was DC versus Mortal Kombat. this game's story was okay, and it was basically in the world of Mortal Kombat and DC at the same exact time. While they were defeating Shao Kahn, and in DC they were defeating Darkseid, they pushed them both into a portal, and because it happened at the same exact time, it merged both characters together, giving us Dark Kahn. And because of this, the worlds of Mortal Kombat and DC were combining. And the one thing that kind of sucked about this game was it was rated T, so it had to be toned down, which sucked because, I mean, Mortal Kombat was known for being rated M. It was known for the blood. It was known for the death, and that had to be toned down. And the biggest complaint about this game was there was no death. Once a character was defeated, they were basically just knocked out. And while the game was okay, this game was essential for inspiring future fighting games, which was basically turned into Injustice and allowed Mortal Kombat to be like, you know what? Well, this game sucked. The idea of having crossovers is a brilliant one, so let's do that, which they did and ran with. In Mortal Kombat 9, the game would feature a crossover with Freddy Krueger, and another crossover would be with the God of War Kratos, which was a PlayStation exclusive. Now, these were the only two characters to be crossover from Mortal Kombat 9, and they played pretty well. After 9, the crossovers would be themed for future games. In Mortal Kombat X, the crossover theme was basically horror movies. So they had crossovers with Jason Voorhees, Predator, Alien, and Leatherhead. And basically it became the theme, which was pretty fun. And each had their own story within the arcade mode, which was pretty fun. I loved learning what happened to Jason, especially Alien, Leatherface. And while some of the gameplay kind of sucked for these characters like Predator, I'm sorry, but Predator sucked playing as in Mortal Kombat. I don't know what they were drinking when they were making his combat stuff, but he was terrible. But it was still fun to watch a video on learning what his ending would be. In Mortal Kombat 11, the crossovers was themed around movie characters. So they had RoboCop, Rambo, Spawn, and Terminator. The latest Mortal Kombat game crossover theme is basically superheroes, which has Peacemaker, Omni-Man, Homelander, and we still have more to come. Of course, they had Joker in there, but still movie characters and superhero themed and stuff like that. And of course, Injustice, another game from NetherRealm Studio, had its own crossovers. They weren't as much themed as Mortal Kombat ones, but they were still pretty cool. You had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Hellboy, Mortal Kombat itself, and others as well. Each was interesting, like each character was interesting to use, and honestly, out of all the crossovers, my favorite one to play as was easily Jason Voorhees. He had this combo, this moveset that basically made you immune to staggering for a short period of time. So no matter what the other characters did, I could just unleash to them different combinations until, of course, his power boost would end and he would be left staggered for like maybe a few seconds. But I abused that so many times during a fighting other players, and it was so much fun. I had so much fun using that, especially towards the end when they were beating me up. I'd use that and just turn the tables. Besides Predator, I think the other worst one crossover was definitely Spawn. I expected so much more from his combinations than what we got, so that was another disappointing one. But like I said, it was pretty fun seeing these characters being there and having their own storylines. Other fighting games would also feature crossovers like Soul Calibur, who had Star Wars, Link, Kratos, and many more. And even other franchises decided to make a fighting game to have crossovers in. PlayStation had PlayStation All-Stars, which basically had all their exclusive characters in the game and basically focused on story mode, and the DLC characters would of course be other PlayStation characters. It wasn't the best fighting game, and like I said, just fighting games in general are easier to have a crossover with because you can have an outlandish reason for having a plot. Like, oh my god, an entity has taken these characters from different worlds and put them here, and they have to figure out what's going on. That would basically be the backbone on the fighting game crossovers. And it was fun. And the most recent fighting game crossover or newest entry in the whole type of genre is from Warner Brothers, which is Multiverse, which is basically exactly what I said. They're there for some godforsaken reason. They don't know why, and they got to figure it out. And as in terms of roster, Warner Brothers has a bunch of characters, including DC characters. So they got characters for days. I mean, when I was playing that game, when it was in beta, Shaggy and Bugs Bunny were my go-to. Tom and Jerry sucked. Batman was okay. I have no idea what they were drinking when they made the Iron Giant. He sucked. So I'm praying when they re-release the game in May that he's actually better. But anyway, not all crossovers games were fighting games. There were some exceptions to this. Mario Kart in recent years have crossovers with other Nintendo characters, which they have their own vehicles and their own maps. Another game which would be a versus but not fighting would be Mario and Sonic. Mario vs. Sonic in the Olympic Games, which was pretty fun. The first one was cool. The others was basically just a fast cash grab. Every time they release a new one, I'm like, nah, I'm not buying it. The most bizarre crossover from Nintendo had to be Mario plus Rabbids. I have no idea where they came up with this game, and I did not see this coming. And honestly, I thought the Rabbids franchise died in the early 2010s. This game was a turn-based tactical, and you know what was the worst thing about this game? It was good, and the sequel was honestly the best tactical game I had ever played. It could be called a masterpiece, and it's very underrated. I think the only reason why it's not more well known was because it was only a Switch exclusive. If it hopped on Xbox and PlayStation, or PC for that matter, I guarantee it would have sold a lot more. Again, it's a masterpiece. I have no idea how. I don't know why. It just is. If you play the game, you'll understand why. And if you are a tactical game nerd loving those types of games and you haven't played this game, you'll fall in love and hate that they're probably not going to make another one because this one undersold. Another non-fighting crossover game, which has to be up there with the Mario plus Rabbids for the most bizarre idea yet, and yet it works, was basically Poker Night Inventory, which basically was a poker game with several different characters from other universes coming together and interacting. This game was hilarious. They just went with the comedy and the interactions because all these characters coming in, I mean, you had Heavy from Team Fortress 2, Brock Sampson from the Venture Bros, Claptrap from Borderlands, Sam and Max from Sam and Max, and many more. And they're just the weirdest characters to have a crossover with. Yet it worked out so well because they played into the comedy. Because these characters are from different universes with different technology. So the fact that they were interacting for a poker game was even better. And basically the theme and the question that this game was answering was, what did these characters do when not on the clock? And again, it was honestly a funny game. The interactions were bizarre, and yet it worked. Honestly, the game, I don't think you can buy this game anymore because of licensing. But if you go and watch the gameplay, especially from Brock Sampson, it's just beautiful. If you love the Venture Bros, definitely watch the gameplay of this game. It's just hilarious. You'll love it and you'll thank me later. Lego and Disney would also try their hands in the crossover genre by doing basically the same thing with two different types of games. The game plots would have characters from different universes coming together to fight the entity or find out why they were crossing over with each other. Again, they were basically the same game, doing the same exact thing. You would buy the base game, which would have the original storyline, which wouldn't be completed, and you had to buy these figurines or Lego pieces to add on to the story. And this game was expensive. I mean, you had dozens of figurines for like $10, $15, $20, and they would be like DLC, adding an extra few hours to the game, or they would just be a skin. Lego, of course, had bigger crossovers as they had dealings with franchises like Ghostbusters, Lord of the Rings, Batman, Harry Potter, Doctor Who, and much, much more. Disney would basically be crossovers from their animated movies to their live action. It was honestly successful in the beginning, but it just became too much and too expensive. And they basically shut down both games when, of course, sales were down because everything revolved around you buying these figurines. So it wasn't a cheap game, and by the end of this whole saga, you now have a bunch of figurines which are basically useless unless you have the actual game. It's, like I said, it was just a bizarre thing that was a thing for about 5 years. But anyway, the next entry in the non-fighting crossover games would be now in the horror genre. And this game, you probably know which one I'm talking about, would be Dead by Daylight. And honestly, this game is fun if you haven't played the game. It's a live service type of game where there's a killer and 4 survivors, and the game is basically having the survivors turn on the generators to try to escape from the killers. Very simple, very straightforward. They added some mechanics which sometimes can be absolutely confusing and frustrating, but that's basically the premise of the game. The company behind this game didn't think this game would blow up, and they basically had to make their own characters, their own killers, and base them off of other characters in movies, TV shows, and etc. After the game blew up and became big, they didn't have to copy and paste killers from other franchises anymore and say it was their own thing. They could literally have killers from other franchises in the games now. I mean, they added Leatherface, Chucky, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, Pinhead, Alien, Wesker and Nemesis from the Resident Evil franchise, the Demogorgon from Stranger Things, and the Chick from The Ring, and many, many more. And that was from the killer side. They added survivors, the good guys from other franchises as well. You have Ripley from the Alien series, Steve and Nancy from Stranger Things, Laurie from Halloween, Ash Williams from Evil Dead, Leon Kennedy from Resident Evil, and many, many more. The most insane crossover to date has to be Nicolas Cage, as playing as himself, and he's a survivor. Honestly, for a while, nobody knew if he was going to be playing a survivor or a killer. I mean, Nicolas Cage has so much range that if they added him as a killer, I don't think anyone would have complained. They would have been like, yep, that sounds like a Nicolas Cage thing to do. And the best part of the crossovers here is that they play into the overarching story, as there's an entity collecting these killers, demons, ghosts, and other entities, and doing something with them. And while they're collecting these killers and other stuff, they're also collecting survivors and trying to do something with them as well. And you're just trying to understand what they're all doing here. And as each season progresses, you get closer and closer to the story. And honestly, this game is freaking amazing, and I love it. I think my favorite killer has to be Chucky, because he can disappear, and because he's so small that him being undetectable for a little bit is a little OP. I'm just enjoying him as a killer. As long as he's OP, I might move on back to the pig who has from the Saw series, who can put traps on people's heads. Honestly, each killer has their own gameplay. The only two I really don't like that I own is Freddy Krueger and Pinhead. They're basically useless and they kind of suck. I wish that the Dead by Daylight devs would change up their gameplay and have them more horror based or more scarier to use, because every time I see them being played, I'm like, oh, this is going to be an easy match. I think the one character that's super scary to go up against when it came to the crossovers is easily Michael Myers and the chick from The Ring. I mean, she has a ranged attack, which is kind of scary. Like, even if you're like jumping over a window, she can still get you. It's insane. But anyway, it just proves that fighting games aren't the only successful franchises to do crossovers, and that they can branch out to other types of games. I mean, look at Battle Royales. They have to be the biggest type of crossover games besides fighting games in recent years. I mean, every Battle Royale now has some type of crossover. Fortnite is probably the biggest one because they've had different crossovers with anime, comic book characters, TV characters, movie characters, and heck, even mythical ones. And sometimes they're not just skins. They are basically a part of the overreaching story. Marvel played a big significant part, as Galactus was the big bad before the chapter ended. And heck, they even had comics with Marvel characters and DC characters showing what they were doing there and how the story overacted with the certain universe. I gotta give credit where credit's due. I mean, Fortnite has a huge job, especially with explaining all these crossovers. And I mean, they do have their W's when it comes to this, but they also have their L's. Personally, my favorite skin that they added was the Predator. I mean, they basically added the Predator to the map where you had to hunt him down to get the skin. My favorite thing, and that was my first premium skin because it was one I earned and one I didn't have to spend money on when I didn't. But besides Fortnite, Call of Duty has done something similar to this, but not as well. When it came to Warzone, I think the biggest crossover I could think of or remember was for King Kong versus Godzilla. I mean, for Warzone, you had both of these characters on the map, and it was so weird because besides trying to avoid other players on the map, you had to watch out for these two as well, because they would randomly throw rocks in certain areas, or Godzilla would blast you with his atomic breath. And if you were in the area for any of these types of attacks, you either had to get out, or if you couldn't, you had to get underground or go inside of a building, praying and hoping that it would be able to shield you from their attacks. It was bizarre, and it was kind of fun, honestly, having things to worry about and having other characters and players be very cautious. But overall, Call of Duty, when it comes to their crossovers, it's just skins. They don't really have anything overreaching. And the one thing I will say about Fortnite that's better when it comes to crossovers, when it came to their skins, Fortnite allows you to keep all of them. Call of Duty, when it came to Warzone 2, basically goodbye skins, which sucks because I wanted to buy the Terminator skin, which was fantastic, and you took damage, the skin comes off showing more of the ectoskeleton, but I couldn't because they already announced Warzone 2 and said none of the skins would be crossing over. So they didn't even get any of my money after that, which sucked because I had Rambo from the Rambo series and John McClane from Die Hard. But anyway, as stated before, having battle royales doing crossovers is becoming more and more of a thing. I wouldn't be surprised if Apex does something where they change the map for a crossover, similar to what Call of Duty did. And I wouldn't be surprised if, like Fortnite, Call of Duty decides to do more of these crossovers multiple times a year like Fortnite. I mean, Fortnite can change the map in an instant. I remember the Star Wars one where they basically had Darth Vader, they had the clone troopers there, and it was pretty fun to fight against them and get their weapons. But as you can probably tell, and through this entire episode, crossovers in games are a growing business. And while battle royales seems to be the new trend happening, there is no telling what the next trend is going to be for crossovers to happen. I don't think we will get like a full-on plot story crossover game where it's not like a battle royale or anything like Fortnite has done. It's just a singular game with a crossover, because I think different companies would be hesitant to do so, especially if they would have their IP look weak compared to others. I mean, if they did a DC versus like Dragon Ball crossover, it'd be interesting to see the power mechanics between Superman and Goku. And I don't even think DC would want these two to fight, or if they did, it'd be like, oh, if you choose this character, that's why they would win. It would not be part of the overarching story, because no company wants to see their IP weaker than another character, even if it would make sense. I say Goku would win against Superman, fight me. Anyway, like I said, I don't think we'll get something like that. For the foreseeable future, it looks like it'll just be maybe something similar to what Dead by Daylight has, a fighting game, or just like a battle royale. Maybe they'll come up with something new, like, I mean, the poker game was definitely out there and it worked, or maybe a tactical game like Mario plus Rabbids. But until then, until someone has this brilliant idea, we just got to wait to see. But anyway, that's it for this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, I apologize for the lateness, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. I'll see you guys hopefully next week, unless something happens. But anyway, just prepare for next week on, let's see, what would that be, the 24th? I think it is the 24th. See you guys back on the 24th. Sayonara, see you later, and have a good one. Goodbye.